We're talking about financial planning, and in the last video, I made what I think is a pretty good case for why companies like yours should do some type of financial planning, do a budget of sort. And sometimes we get confused over some of the terminology in financial planning. So let me try to clear that up a little bit. Start with a budget. A budget is typically, usually we do like a 1-year budget. And it's typically done for accountability. Who's going to be responsible for that $1 million in revenue this year? Who's going to be responsible for managing certain expenses? Who's going to be responsible for profitability of the business and whatever we've planned for? So the budget is usually done for accountability purposes. Then we also hear forecast. A forecast tends to be a little more optimistic than a budget and usually done over a period of multiple years. We forecast next year, we forecast 3 years, maybe even 5 years forecast. And then in financial planning, we also talk about doing projections. Again, projections tend to be over multiple years, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. And projections tend to be more what ifs. What if we doubled our sales next year? What if we hit $100 million in revenue in 5 years? Those are projections. So sometimes we'll use these terms, as if they're the same, and that's okay. No reason to nitpick, but just know in classic accounting terms, we tend to differentiate between budget, forecast, and projections. So now turn to the next page of your handout. When we do budgeting, typically we go through three steps in budgeting. The first step is to do what's referred to as a preliminary budget. Sometimes we refer to this as a napkin budget because it's something that's done kind of informally on the back of a napkin. Preliminary budget would say, okay, next year, what are we looking at in terms of total revenue, 12 months total revenue, cost of sales, gross profit or gross margin, total operating expenses, operating profit. Maybe 5 line items or so in the preliminary budget. Just top of mind, let's think about, based on what we've done historically, based on what we see going on in the environment around us, what are we thinking for next year in terms of a budget, preliminary budget? The second step is, once we've done that preliminary budget, the second step is to take that preliminary budget and now add a lot more detail to those numbers. So then we're going to get to doing a 12-month financial budget. 12-month meaning we're going to come up with numbers for each month, for each line item. So we're going to take sales and break sales into maybe different categories, different target markets, different products. Then we're going to take our expenses and do the same thing with our expenses, as much detail as possible. So, and you'll see in the materials that you have access to a great example of a 12-month budget. And there's actually a template for creating that 12-month budget that I would encourage you to take a look at and maybe employ within your business. All right. So the second step is to create that detailed 12-month financial budget. Third step, and probably the most overlooked step in budgeting, is then to monitor, to review this budget over the course of time. And what I recommend to my clients is to review the budget versus actual on a monthly basis. What were our sales compared to what we budgeted? What were our expenses, line item versus what we budgeted? Review that budget versus actual every month. And then be prepared to adjust, to update the budget on a quarterly basis as needed. So if you projected $1 million in sales for next year, which would be about $250,000 in revenue every quarter, and after the first quarter you're at $500,000, clearly you're gonna move right past that $1 million annual mark pretty quickly. So why stick with that as your budget for this year when clearly you're going to beat those numbers? Or it could be the opposite. You could fall way behind to the point where you say, we could never hit that $1 million in annual sales. So good time on a quarterly basis to adjust our numbers as needed. What I find is that companies take different paths, different processes for doing budgeting. One is a top-down process where they start with their revenue projections, annual, and then break it down on a monthly basis. And then from those sales projections, they come up with their cost of sales projections and gross margin, and then work their way down through all of their operating expenses. And then they just kind of end up with whatever's left for profit, operating and net profit. Top-down approach, probably the most common approach in budgeting. I prefer a slightly different approach, and it's a bottom-up approach. Bottom-up approach says, okay, what do we want to end up this year with profit? Remember, profit is one of our most important financial goals. How much profit do we want at the end of the year? And then work our way up to say, okay, what do we need to do to achieve that profit? What do we need to do in terms of our spending on overhead operations? What do we need in terms of sales and gross margin? Bottom-up approach, because too often if we use the top to bottom, we end up with whatever for profit. And I don't think we want to leave that in that regard. I think we want to start with what's our goal for profitability, and then let's figure out how we can get there. A bottom-up approach. And a third approach to budgeting is referred to as zero-based budgeting. Oftentimes when we budget, particularly for expenses, we look at, okay, marketing, last year we spent this much, maybe we'll spend a little bit more this year. So we take whatever we did last year and adjust it up or down. That's very common. Zero-based budgeting essentially wipes out all of the previous numbers for expenses, and we start with zero, and we say, okay, in order to achieve either that top line goal or maybe the bottom line goal, how much do we need to spend for this expense, whether it's labor, it's marketing, it's office rental, whatever it is. We just have to say, we ask ourselves, okay, to achieve these goals, what do we need to spend, regardless of what we spent in the past? Because too often we just bump that number up every year, and it may or may not be realistic for this year. Zero-based budgeting says, okay, what do we need to spend this year to achieve this or this? Okay. Something else that I suggest in budgeting, too often when we do that 12-month budget, we do it on a calendar year. So it starts in January, ends in December, calendar year budget. And that's not a bad practice, but what I prefer is something what's referred to as a rolling 12-month budget. And here's why. If we do the calendar year budget, January through December, when we're looking at that budget first quarter, okay, everything's looking good. We're looking ahead anywhere from 9 to 12 months. That's good. That's like driving your car and seeing hundreds of yards in front of you. But what happens when we get mid-year? Now we're only looking 6 months ahead. That's like driving your car and being able to see ahead maybe 100 yards, nowhere near the visibility forward that you would like to have. 6 months. Now we get to the end of the third quarter. We're still working off that 1 year calendar year budget. Now all we're looking forward is 3 months. That's like driving your car and all you see is the end of your hood of your car. That would be dangerous. It's dangerous to work off of a 3-month budget as well. So a rolling 12-month budget, what we do is every month we add a month and subtract a month so that we are always looking ahead 12 months. So in January, we're looking at January through December. February, we're looking at February through January of the next year, and so on. We add a month, subtract a month, always looking out 12 months. I just think that's a much better practice in terms of budgeting. What will you do?